All right, let's talk about the life of David Brainerd. He was a missionary to Native Americans back in the 18th century, and his story is just full of these incredible contradictions. Here's a man whose body was literally wasting away, yet God used him in a way that's, well, it's just extraordinary. His life really challenges our modern ideas of what success in ministry is supposed to look like.
Brainerd wrote these words in his diary. You can just feel the tension in that, can't you? He longed for the relief of heaven, but at the same time he was totally willing to stick around and endure all his suffering if it meant he could do something for Christ's kingdom here on earth. That's really the core conflict you see all through his journals.
Okay, so to really get a handle on Brainerd's ministry, we first have to grasp just how much he suffered physically. This wasn't an occasional sickness or a bad cold. It was his daily reality, something that shaped every single part of his life.
Brainerd's diary paints this just brutal picture of his day-to-day. He wasn't just tired. He'd write about being extremely worn out. He wasn't just sick, he was coughing up what he called bloody matter, a pretty clear sign of the consumption or tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. And on top of all that physical stuff, he was battling this deep, crushing depression he called his vapory disorders. Now add in the fact that he was often sleeping in the woods, exposed to the elements, with very little food, and you start to see a man who was constantly at his breaking point.
Listen to his own words. His body was in such distress that he couldn't even hold his hands still. You can understand why death would start to sound like a welcome escape from that kind of constant pain.
So all this constant sickness, it wasn't just a physical thing. It had a huge spiritual effect on him. It was the very thing that drove him from a place of despair over how useless he felt to a place where he had to depend completely and totally on God.
On the one hand, he saw what he called his own barrenness, his complete inability to accomplish anything of real spiritual value. But this crushing sense of his own weakness actually led him to this incredible breakthrough. He realized that any conversion, any spiritual fruit had to be entirely God's work. He was just a voice speaking to dry bones, just like in Ezekiel. Only God could bring those bones to life.
This quote came right after he preached a sermon where he felt like he just completely failed. He felt dry, empty, and useless. But instead of getting angry or frustrated about it, he submitted. And this wasn't a passive, oh well, kind of resignation. It was an active choice to agree with God, to say amen, even when God's will meant his own public failure. So what came out of this hard-fought dependence on God? Well, what happened next is just amazing. Out of this state of total acknowledged weakness came the most fruitful period of his entire ministry, the spiritual awakening at Crossweeksung.
The timing here is just remarkable. At the very moment his health was collapsing, a revival was breaking out. In June of 1745, he notes in his diary that he could feel God's presence was with his preaching. By August, that feeling turned into widespread conversions. And then less than a year later, a new congregation of Native American believers was officially formed, and they were taking the Lord's Supper together.
31. That's how many Native American converts took part in that first communion service. Now, this wasn't just a number to him. It represented a real, genuine work of God in that community. And the scene that went with it was incredible.
This quote just gets right to the heart of that moment. You can picture it, right? He uncovers the bread and the wine, the symbols of Christ's sacrifice, and nearly everyone is in tears. This wasn't some abstract idea to them. It was a deeply felt reality.
Brainerd's entire experience is just a perfect illustration of this scriptural truth. It was when he was most aware of his own weakness, his own frailty, that God's strength was put on display in the most obvious way through his ministry.
So what's the big takeaway from David Brainerd's life? Well, it's a lesson in what it truly means to be completely given over to a purpose that's bigger than yourself. A life that is, quite literally, poured out.
This declaration from his diary, it just says it all. He was willing to give up everything, his comfort, his health, even his own life, if it would just serve Christ and advance his kingdom. This wasn't some reckless wish. It was a settled surrender of his entire being to God. And so, we're left with this question to chew on. Brainerd's life forces us to think about it. In a world that values self-sufficiency and strength above all else, his story suggests that true spiritual effectiveness isn't found in what we can do, but in what God does through us when we finally admit that, on our own, we can do nothing.